if you want to understand why, what people will always say when I point that out is, well, why would he bother to give that? Why would he bother to spend so much time giving the law if he knew he was going to send Jesus and just give us grace? Well, the reason he did was it was necessary. We have to figure that God's smarter than we are. And it all goes back to a man named Adam in the beginning who did something wrong. Did you know that when Adam and Eve were made by God in the Garden of Eden, that they were living in a condition of perfect grace? Did you ever think of that? Why do I say that? Because God did everything. God made the garden. Adam didn't plant the garden. He didn't have to plant those trees. He didn't have to do all that. God did it all. He made the garden first, and then He made Adam and Eve. There was a perfect garden, a perfect condition. And really, did you know, and I hate to point this out, but when He made Adam and Eve, He didn't give them any laws. He didn't give them any rules. All He said was stay away from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which sounds like laws to me, knowledge of good and evil. He said stay away from that, but otherwise He didn't tell them anything to do. You know why? Because He didn't need to. Can I say something really, just blunt? And Paul says it too. The law was made for lawbreakers. And Adam and Eve, in the beginning, were made in God's image and in His likeness. They didn't need a law because they had a nature. They could live by the nature that was in them and have a relationship with God. And the reason God didn't have to give a law to Adam saying, "Thou shalt not kill," because it was not in his nature to kill. The reason God didn't have to say to Adam, "Do not steal," is because it was not in his nature. He had the nature he received from God. Does that make sense? It was natural for him to be godly because he got it from God. Made in His image and in His likeness. God breathed that very life into him. And it was not until he disobeyed God and fell from that place. Let me show you something. Elliot, look in Romans chapter 5 just for a second. We read this last week, but I want to read it to you in the message. I skipped this last week. Romans chapter 5 and verse, let's see now. I think I want verse 14. Let's try that. Romans chapter 5. Could you give it to me in the Message translation? Go back one. I think I need the one before that. Yeah, go back one more. Let's get the one before it. I'm going backwards. You know the story of how Adam landed us in the dilemma we're in. Now that's what I'm talking about. The reason God found it necessary, and it was necessary, He knew it from the beginning. The reason God gave the law to Moses was it was necessary. Adam made a big mistake, and his big mistake was disobeying God and eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which God told him not to, which he didn't need. People always say, well, why did God tell him not to eat of it? Well, he didn't need it. He didn't need knowledge of good and evil. He had a relationship with God. He had a nature he got from God. And so he says, you know how the story of Adam landed us in the dilemma we're in. First sin, then death. No one exempt from either sin or death. Next verse. Listen carefully. That sin, meaning Adam's sin, that sin disturbed relations with God in everything and in everyone. But the extent of the disturbance was not clear. Listen. The extent of the disturbance was not clear until God spelled it out in detail to Moses. What does He mean by that? What is it that God spelled out in detail to Moses? He gave him in great detail, in great specificity, the Old Testament law. And what was the purpose of that, according to what Paul is saying here? To show the extent of the disturbance. How far away from God mankind really was at that point. I say at that point because as Christians, that's all restored. So death, this huge abyss separating us from God, dominated the landscape from Adam to Moses. Well, let's go ahead and get one more. We'll get the good news and finish this. Even to those who didn't sin precisely as Adam did by disobeying a specific command of God, still had to experience this termination of life, the separation from God. But Adam, who got us into this, also points to the one who gets us out of this. Now, who is the one who gets us out of this? Well, it's Jesus. Now, I point all that out to you to say that Adam was living in a state of grace until he fell from grace by embracing the knowledge of good and evil. Did you know, in very similar language, again, I have these. I wonder sometimes. Sometimes I just sit and wonder, why do people call me on the phone and want to engage me in these long, argumentative conversations? I'm a nice person. I don't bother them. I don't call them up and argue. I don't know why it is, but I have. I had these. I wish I could just. Sometimes I'll be honest. I like to hear from all of you. Please, all of you call me anytime you want. But I would like sometimes just unplug the phone and just do away with the telephone. A person called me up, because I believe as Christians, really, and you've heard me say it this morning, all we've really done is believe in Jesus, put our faith in Him. And so people say, well, don't you believe you can fall from grace? Oh, yes, I think that's right, if you understand rightly what it means. And let me just read this to you real quick. Elliot, I'm going to give Elliot a workout today. Give me Galatians chapter 5. Galatians chapter 5, and look at verse 4. Yes, when people say, don't you believe you can fall from grace? But it's not like what you think. Christ has become of no effect unto you. Whosoever you are justified by the law, you're fallen from grace. That's how you fall. Do you know how you fall from grace? The same way Adam did when he went to the knowledge of good and evil. And it doesn't mean you're not saved anymore. It just means listen, this is what I'm working on. Why did John, after giving us all that beautiful language about Jesus, how He comes full of grace and God's gifts and blessing upon blessing and favor upon favor, why does He then turn around and say, the law came by Moses, but grace came by Jesus? Grace and the reality. It's because Moses came and explained how far everybody was away from God. The result of what Moses did was people under the law should have said, boy, if God is this holy, I need a Savior. So when the Savior came, those who under the law should have received Him. And Paul here writes to Christians and he says, you know what? If you're going to be justified, if you think you're going to be justified by the law, then you don't need Jesus anymore. In other words, if you think you're going to be right with God by your own performance, then you don't need a Savior. In other words, you're not depending on grace. If it's either you or it's Him, but not both. That's what he's saying. Grace or Christ has become of no effect to you, whosoever of you are justified by the law. Justified means made right in the sight of God. You've fallen from grace. But we don't want to fall from grace. Grace is what God does for us all by Himself. Grace is His gifts. And what John is saying, what he's trying to make the point about, is that it's not something that it's not about our performance. It's just purely His gift. And here's one that says that in a nice plain way. Look at Ephesians chapter 2. Very famous verse, and everybody's familiar with it. But just because it is doesn't mean we can't read it once more. First point is, grace is God's favor and His blessing and His free gifts. And it's unmerited. And it stands in contrast to our work. We don't work for it. We don't earn it. We don't deserve it. It's just purely His gift. Ephesians 2 verse 8 says, by grace. Now what is grace again? Well, it's God's favor and it's His blessing. It's what He does for us all by Himself. Sometimes we say it's His unmerited favor. I like that. That's exactly true. It's just His goodness and His grace. It has nothing to do with what we have earned. For by grace are you saved, through faith, not of yourselves. It's the gift of God. Now when he says by grace you're saved, and by the way, saved, that's legitimate New Testament language. I had a lady one time right here in this church. This has been a long time ago, and I'm pretty confident none of you sitting here know who I'm talking about, because this was quite a while back. But a woman who, I think she maybe came 4 or 5 times, but she got really mad at me one day. Can you imagine that? Can you believe that? And after church was over and I'm shaking hands with everybody and smiling and happy, and I don't see why anybody would ever get mad at me because I'm so happy and smiling all the time. But she came up right here in this very building. And I'd read maybe this verse, I don't know, and the word saved came up in the message. Well, in my defense, it's right here in the Bible. You see it right there on the screen. I'm not making it up. It's not. And she was mad because I used that word. What do you mean saved? What do you mean by this saved? What do I need? What do I need that for? Isn't God love? I mean, why do I need saved? What? And that offended her. That bothered her. Well, the reason it's necessary, the reason that it says that is we do need to be saved from, rescued from where we were apart from Christ.